Hi, my name is Gene Luen Yang. I am a cartoonist. I write and draw comic books and graphic novels. And this past year, during 2020, I had two different books come out. The very first one is Dragon Hoops. This is my very first nonfiction graphic novel. Up until this point, I'd always made up my stories. This tells the real life story of a high school basketball team that I followed for the 2014-2015 season. I used to be a teacher at Bishop O'Dowd High School in Oakland, California, and that school has a nationally renowned basketball program. Because I was a computer science teacher, I really had nothing to do with that program. Well, during the 2014-2015 season, I got to know Coach Lou Richie. He is a PE teacher at that school, and he's also the head of the varsity men's team. Lou and I had been on the same campus for over a decade, but we weren't really friends. I'd never really talked to him until the beginning of that season. And he told me this really crazy story. That story ended up being the first chapter of the book, and it also convinced me that I had to do a graphic novel about him and his team. So here's the story. Lou isn't just a coach and a teacher at Bishop O'Dowd. He is also an alum. And when he was a junior in high school, he was the backup point guard on the varsity men's team. That team made it all the way to the California State Championships. This was 1989. And Lou was on that court with 7 seconds left. This was played in what was called the Oakland Arena back then. It's now called the Oracle Arena. It's up until recently the home of the Golden State Warriors. This was the biggest game of young Lou's life. It was televised. So 7 seconds left. He is on that court. His team is down by one, and somehow that ball makes it into his hands. He puts it up at the buzzer. It goes through the hoop. They win by one. They freak out. Lou and his coach and his fellow players are all jumping up and down on the court. And then over the intercom comes the ref's whistle. Supposedly, the center of Lou's team had his hand on the rim as that ball was falling through that hoop. So the refs called offensive goaltending. This shot, the biggest shot of 17-year-old Lou's life, ends up getting invalidated. His team loses by one. Lou ends up going to college. He plays for UCLA and then for Clemson. Eventually, a hamstring injury ends his playing career, but he never forgot about that shot. He thought about that shot for years. He eventually makes his way back to Bishop O'Dowd, first as an assistant coach and then as a head coach. As an assistant coach and as a head coach, he led 5 teams to the California State Championships. So he had these 5 different chances to finally redeem this old hurt from when he was a kid. He lost all 5 times. The reason why I wanted to follow his team during the 2014-2015 season was because he had these 2 kids on that team. Their names were Ivan Rabb and Paris Austin. Ivan is now playing for the NBA. He's in New York, and Paris just graduated from UC Berkeley. These 2 kids were the best players that Bishop O'Dowd had seen in a really long time. So supposedly, the 2014-2015 season was Coach Lou Richie's best chance to finally redeem that old hurt from when he was a teenager. I wanted to find out if he could do it. I followed that team. I wrote about it. I'm not going to tell you right now whether he did it or not because I want you to read the book. But doing this book really changed me as well. When I was a kid, I was not a basketball player or a basketball fan. I don't know if you could tell from looking at me on the screen, but I am not an athlete in any way. When I was a kid, the basketball court was this arena of humiliation for me. Every time I stepped on, I'd get hurt. I'd either get a ball to my head, or I'd get my fingers jammed, or I'd get my feelings hurt. So I tried to avoid basketball as much as possible. But following that team of coaches and players for a season really changed my perspective. I realized that basketball is not just a game. It is not just a sport. It actually has all these ties to real life. Basketball is about courage. It's about respect. It's about perseverance. And it's even about civil rights. A lot of what happened on the basketball courts in the past affect the way we think now today in modern America. So now I do consider myself a basketball fan. I'm not an expert by any means, but I am a fan because I realize the importance of basketball in the context of American history. That's the first book. The second book to come out in 2020 is Superman Smashes the Klan. This is a book that I did with an art team called Guri Hiru. They are out of Japan. They're an art studio out of Japan. It's lettered by Janice Chang. And this is actually a retelling of one of the most famous stories in the Superman mythos. Way back in 1946, Superman had the most popular radio show in America. It was right after World War II. Superman had spent all of those war years fighting Nazis. And then the writers' room realized that after the Nazis were defeated in real life, Superman couldn't keep fighting them on his radio show. So they started thinking, what is the biggest threat to peace in post-war America? Nobody's sure who came up with this idea, but they decided to have Superman go up against a group of hooded bigots, a group of hooded racists. This was a controversial idea at the time because back then the Ku Klux Klan, the real life hooded bigots, were seen not as a terrorist organization, but as a community organization in some areas of America. They knew they were going to get some pushback for it. But in the end, they decided to do it. And in June of 1946, the 16-part Clan of the Fiery Kross storyline airs on the Superman radio show. They did get a lot of that pushback that they were expecting. There were calls for boycotts of the radio show's sponsors. They even got death threats from the New Jersey Klan. But they also fundamentally changed America with this storyline. Supposedly, after Superman took on the Klan in his radio show, nobody wanted to join. The real life Klan saw this tremendous drop in membership. Nobody wanted to be a part of a group that was against Superman. You know, I've been a comic book geek for all of my life, and one of the criticisms that I used to get, especially from my immigrant parents, is that these stories that I love so much, these stories about people in tights wearing capes, really didn't have anything to do with the real world. But here was a concrete example of how a story about a man in a red cape really affected our real world. The story about this man in a red cape actually dealt a tremendous PR blow to hate in America. I think it is a prime example of how the stories that we tell, even stories about fictional characters, can have real world effects. The very first comic book I got was actually a Superman comic. It was DC Comics Presents number 57, starring Superman. My mom bought me this comic off of a spinner rack at our local bookstore when I was in the 5th grade. And pretty soon after that, I became kind of obsessed with them. I think I was obsessed for a few reasons. One is this was a way of telling stories through drawing. I always loved stories. I grew up in a house full of stories. My mom and my dad used to tell me stories all the time. It was sort of their primary way of relating with me and my brother. And I also loved drawing. I started drawing when I was 2 years old, and I basically haven't stopped. Comics, I realized from getting that first issue, was a way of combining these two things. It was a way of telling stories through drawing. The other thing that I really love about comics is that the dividing line between who is a creator and who is a reader is really permeable. It is super fuzzy and super easy to cross. You know, all you really need are some pens and some paper and some time. You just sit down and write and draw a comic, and there you are. You've crossed that line. Anybody can do it. Back when I was growing up in the 80s, if a kid wanted to make a movie or if they wanted to cut a music album, those things were largely inaccessible to kids back then. But anybody back then and now could make comic books. American comics books have had a really weird and checkered past when it comes to issues of race and ethnicity. The company that I work for right now, one of the companies, DC Comics, the D and the C in that company name stands for Detective Comics. So the name of the company doesn't really make sense. It's Detective Comics Comics. The reason why they named the company DC is because Detective Comics is actually the company's longest running monthly comic book series. It began in 1937. It has been published continuously every month since then with no breaks. Detective Comics #1, if you look at the cover of it, it's pretty rough. The main character isn't Superman, isn't Batman, it isn't any of the characters that we know and love today. It's actually a character named Qin Lung, who is a yellow peril villain. He is a Chinese super genius who is bent on taking over the Western world. And if you look at that cover, he's drawn in this really monstrous and inhuman way. That was really common. Those sorts of images, not just for Chinese Americans, but stereotypical images for people of color, were very, very common in the early days of comics. And I think a lot of that is because comics is a visual format. So it speaks about the issues of the culture in these really visual ways. And when you approach things from the perspective of stereotype, you end up getting these really, what we would see today as really offensive visuals. But on the flip side, I do think that comics, especially within the last couple of decades, have dealt with issues of race and ethnicity and culture in very, very serious ways. The flip side of this visual nature of the medium is that you can talk about things very viscerally, you know, and I feel like I have tried to do that with my own work. I've tried to use the visceral nature of comic books to get across some of the unease of growing up as an Asian in America. So American ingenuity is the theme of the conference, and I think that really does tie very well with comic books and graphic novels. Comic book people, I don't know if this is true because I haven't done the homework on it yet, but comic book people I've heard say that comic books and jazz are the two truly American art forms. They're the two art forms that were invented here in America. And because of that, I think the comics really express something deeply American. You know, they kind of bridge what we think of as high art and low art. They, at their best, they kind of, they make those distinctions disappear. And they allow the creators and the readers to wrestle with issues in this almost boundless way, in a way where their thinking doesn't necessarily have to fit in boxes. I think it's because the tradition of comics is still so new. Graphic novels and comic books as we know it is less than 100 years old. So we don't have these traditional ideas about what a comic book really ought to be. And I think, especially in America, within the last 20 years, we've seen a comic book and graphic novel renaissance, where many of the best comics and graphic novels that have ever been produced in this country are being produced right now. Some of this stuff you can really see is pushing the bounds, not just of subject matter, but also of the way in which stories are told on the page. I think it's really exciting to be a part of comics right now because of that. I think one of the aspects of making a graphic novel is that you have to face that blank page, right? At the very beginning, you are looking at that page, and what I think about as a graphic novelist is, how am I gonna get my reader's eyes to go from the beginning of the page, however that's defined, to the end of that page? The way you do that, it can be like the number of ways in which you get the reader's eye to go from the beginning of the page to the end is pretty much infinite. You can almost do anything you want. And because of that, I think when you are managing the reader's gaze on a page, you are also managing the reader's gaze in an issue or in a topic, you know? And I think that's really what comics offers. Comics offers a way of navigating a reader both visually and through text, through complex issues and complex topics and complex emotions as well. This is some advice that I was given about creativity a long time ago, creativity and ingenuity, and I've tried to follow it ever since. Creativity is almost never out of nothing. Nobody creates out of nothing. You know what I mean? And what I've heard and what I've read is that often our best examples of creativity live in the in-between spaces, between two things that people in general don't expect to go together. I think comics in a lot of ways is kind of like that, right? Comics sits in between these two older traditions. It sits in between a tradition of visual art and a tradition of literature. And it kind of creates something new in that in-between space. The the benefit for me personally about thinking about ingenuity and creativity in this way is I feel like it takes a lot of the pressure off. I'm not like trying to create something out of nothing, you know. I can look at examples of what came before. And the second thing is I think it makes me more appreciative. It makes me more grateful for what came before. I know that whatever quote unquote new thing I come up with is built on top of things that came before. It's built in these in-between spaces that are defined by art forms and ideas that came before me. Right now, I am in San Jose, California. I am in my daughter's bedroom as I speak with you, which is like a makeshift studio. We've turned into a makeshift studio since the lockdown began. Back in the olden days, I used to have a workspace that I would go to. It was a workspace that was mostly people who worked in tech. I was the only comics guy there, but it was at least a space apart from my home. And now I do most of my work in my house in these different areas. It depends on who I'm trying to escape, right? Like sometimes I'll work in my living room, sometimes I'll work at the coffee table, sometimes I'll work in one of my kids' bedrooms. I've told people in the past that I find drawing the most time consuming. That's why I don't draw all of my graphic novels. There's no way. I mean, I don't have the art chops to pull off some of the stories I want to tell, but I also don't have enough time because I'm such a slow artist. It's the most time consuming, but writing is the most soul wrenching. Almost always before I sit down to face that blank page, I want to do something else. I want to escape. I want to go do dishes, or I want to rearrange my Lego collection. I want to do something else. It's only after I force myself to sit down and start writing, like maybe 10 minutes in, I'll start to feel good about it. But in terms of where it starts, like what actually gets me to sit down is almost always a voice in my head. I'll hear a character talking to me. At some point, that voice gets so loud, I just have to sit it down and put it on paper. Otherwise, I won't be able to sleep at night. This is a part of the Library of Congress. I got those at the end of my stint as the National Ambassador for Young People's Literature. So I was the National Ambassador for Young People's Literature for 2016 and 2017. That is a position with the Library of Congress. Carla Hayden was my boss. She didn't like it when I said that, but it was true. She was totally my boss, and it was super fun. But at the end of that stint, they gave me those bookends. I think libraries are important for a billion different reasons. Here's one. Libraries are the keepers of stories. Stories define culture, right? And whether or not we have a hopeful culture or a culture that's mired in despair is completely up to the stories that we tell. It's completely up to the stories that are taken care of by our libraries, that are collected and disseminated by our libraries.